Get your win at WallaceWins.com.
All right, welcome to our next episode of the WallaceWins.com podcast with special guest in the house, Chandra Gehri Spencer. Welcome.
Thanks. Glad to be here.
We're very, very happy to have you. And for those of you that don't know, Chandra Gehri Spencer is an attorney and a partner at Elder & Spencer, a law firm specializing in housing rights and housing discrimination cases. So we're really interested to have you in studio today to talk about your practice and get to know you a little bit better. So welcome.
Thank you. So glad to be here. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. Now, before we get into the meat and potatoes of some of the legal questions and you talking about your legal practice, we always like to start off our podcast with a little segment called Rapid Fire. And if you've seen any of our clips, you know what's coming. So I'm going to rapid fire a bunch of questions off to you, and I want you to just quickly, whatever comes to mind, throw it out there for the world to hear.
Okay.
Are you ready?
I think I am.
All right. Coolest place you've ever been?
80 feet below the ocean in Galapagos.
Wow.
Checking out whale sharks.
Hopefully not checking out the Titanic.
No.
Okay.
No, in the Galapagos Islands with the tank on my back, of course.
Best sport to watch?
Women's soccer.
All right.
Yes.
They're playing right now in the World Cup.
Right now, World Cup.
Let's go, USA. Best sport to play?
Swimming. I guess do you play swimming or you just do swimming? But swimming.
I think swimming's a sport. I think
it is a sport, for sure.
Everyone would agree that swimming is a sport, except for the late, great George Carlin.
Okay.
Who said swimming is not a sport. Swimming is a way to keep from drowning.
Oh, good point. Maybe it's both.
All right. Movie you've seen more than any other?
Sleepless in Seattle.
First band you saw live?
Frankie Goes to Hollywood when I was 15 years old.
Best city you have ever lived in?
Oh, shoot. Well, where I live now, I guess. Agora Hills.
All right. Shout out to Agora.
Right. Agora High School people right here.
Most famous person you've ever met?
Presidents Ford, Carter, and Bush at the same time.
Wow. That's pretty famous.
Yeah.
Best month of the year?
I would say June.
Best comedian you have ever seen live?
I'm going to say Jay Leno because that's the only one I can remember right now.
Maybe after this podcast, you'll say me.
Yeah, maybe.
Favorite sports team?
Right now it's a tie between Angel City Football Club and the Green Bay Packers.
Childhood hero?
Mother Teresa.
Can't go wrong there.
No. Teenagehood hero, I would add Melinda Gates to that mix.
Okay. And lastly, hidden talent most people don't know you have?
Because I don't do it very often, I'm actually a decent cook when I choose to.
All right.
People wouldn't expect that from me because I do it so rarely.
Fair enough.
Yeah.
And that has been Rapid Fire.
Thank you. That was fun.
All right. So we're a little warmed up.
Okay.
Right?
I'm ready.
It's always nice to just kind of jump into the fray and get a little warmed up. But obviously, as I introduced you today, talked about, your position at your firm, a partner at Elder & Spence, specializing in housing discrimination cases, as well as housing rights cases. For the folks out there that may not know exactly what that is, can you tell us about your law practice, what kinds of cases you handle, and what you specialize in?
So the easy way to put it is that I sue slumlords for a living. Our practice is built around helping people who are living in substandard housing, meaning they have things, gross things happening like cockroaches and bed bugs and sewage and those horrible things that no one should have to live with. So we sue the landlord on behalf of the tenants, the landlord who allows us conditions to continue. And then also we do housing discrimination cases and harassment cases on behalf of the tenants, always on behalf of the tenants. So, for example, if the landlord has a special rule that discriminates against children, or they don't allow their tenants to have emotional support animals, or they're making selection based on sexual orientation. In the state of California, sexual orientation is protected class. We'll sue the landlord. And oftentimes we find that some of these slumlords, there's a crossover there. They're like multi-purpose discriminators. There was one in Central California that we had. And this guy pretty much discriminated up against everybody for every reason and did some horrible things. And then also there's some new rules on tenant harassment in some of the cities in California. So in the right circumstance, if a landlord's really anxious to get a tenant out without a justifiable reason, sometimes they will just constantly harass the tenant to get them out, especially because now in California, we have what I like to call statewide rent control. So in 2019, we passed the Tenant Protection Act, which only allows the landlord to raise rent by a certain percentage according to a formula in the statute. And landlords don't like that. They want to be able to raise the rent however they want. They don't like rent control. So now they're looking for reasons to get rid of those tenants so they can try to make more money.
Understood. Now, as you were sharing a little bit about your practice, one thing that popped in my mind is most of the clients that you represent folks who have already secured housing, signed a lease, and live there, or does it also, include folks who may be looking for housing but feel that they're being discriminated against and not given an opportunity to secure that particular property?
That's a possibility. It doesn't happen very often, but that certainly could be a possibility if the landlord is making decisions. And we work with a lot of the local fair housing councils on cases like that. Sometimes the Fair Housing Council will go out and actually send out testers who will see if this landlord is making decisions that obviously are discriminating against like families with children. For example, they'll send in a couple who doesn't have any children, and then they'll send in a couple that has children and see if they get offered the same deal. And so it's possible, but most of the time our cases are people who are living there and we're really trying to help them preserve their housing and have a safe and habitable place for their families to live.
Understood. That's amazing. You mentioned the Fair Housing Council. How much of your practice do you see their involvement in the cases, and how helpful do you see that government agency being in terms of the field of what you do?
It really depends on the jurisdiction. So the interesting thing about that is that there's a series of types of fair housing councils. And so it depends in some areas. The fair housing councils are really helpful and really active. And in other areas, not so much. Funding, staffing. But we have some really good partnerships, I would say, with those councils. We work with them. We teach classes at their conferences. And they really know that when a tenant has a really severe problem, that we're there and available to help them figure it out. And so I think that they, for the most part, do really good work. Like any other government agency, they're overwhelmed. And just like the legal aid organizations too, especially right now in California, us housing lawyers are really, really busy because a lot of things happened during COVID and coming out of COVID. And I mentioned that statewide rent control. So these governmental agencies, they don't have enough capacity to help everybody.
Right.
And so private firms like mine can help fill the void in the right circumstance. And we're able to serve people and give them a really good service. And then this is also how we make a living.
Right.
And so it's nice to work with agencies like that and nonprofits.
Yeah.
I love the nonprofit world. There's so many good and well-meaning things that happen out there. But it's nice to have that kind of nonprofit and for-profit partnership in what we do. Absolutely.
You mentioned just briefly that in your area of practice, housing rights, housing discrimination type cases, that a lot of things have changed since COVID. You mentioned the Rent Control Act. And I know also just from kind of reading the news, there was also a statewide kind of moratorium on evictions that went on.
Right.
But in general, can you talk about some of the changes in the housing landscape that you've seen in California since COVID, including, for example, things that we read about relative to buying a home becoming more and more unaffordable and more people having to rent and kind of the environment changing in that respect?
Yeah, I don't know. Like as far as the landscape of the affordability, I think that's a big factor for a lot of different reasons. Most of my clients are very low income. They're very unsophisticated people, typically, a lot of immigrants, people of color, and people who are being targeted for that very reason too and taken advantage of. Most of my clients are never in a position where they're going to be able to buy their own home. But the rental prices have skyrocketed. There's a severe shortage of affordable housing. I think it's nationwide. I do think it's nationwide, but we certainly see it here in California. Like during COVID, unbelievable to me, real estate prices started just going through the roof. And I've been expecting them to come down, and they really haven't very much. And so with that comes people who can't afford to buy a place are going to go rent, and then they're competing with other people for that space. We also have a severe deterioration in our housing stock, and that's where a lot of the slum conditions come from if you have landlords who aren't willing to invest in their properties. And that got even worse during COVID. The bad buildings got worse, and the good buildings kind of maintained their status quo. So
what are some of the reasons you think that the bad buildings got worse during COVID?
Well,
just the overall quarantine and not sending people out to do repairs?
I mean, in fairness to the landlords, they probably weren't getting any money in for at least at the beginning. They've certainly gotten a lot of government money since then. Most landlords have pretty well been made whole at this point through all the various programs. I think the not necessarily not letting people in, but it kind of gave the landlords an opportunity to say, we don't have to do anything. And I also do believe that this kind of labor shortage that we've been seeing in that $15 to $25 to $30 an hour price range has its effect, because we don't have as many, for example, we don't have as many code enforcement officers in certain jurisdictions who are holding the landlords accountable. We have tenants who don't want to fight back because they're worried they're going to lose their housing. Even though the law protects them, they don't know that. And then we have landlords who are cutting back on their maintenance staff and haven't hired up again. And then we have the ones that we typically deal with that no matter what, you're not going to get them to spend money on their building because that's part of their business model. They deliberately create this business model where they spend less than the good landlords. And it's funny because when I deal with people who work in housing, who are landlords, who are good landlords, I'll often tell them, I'm your friend. Because that other slumlord down the street who is not paying what you're paying to maintain their building is making more profit than you are and still charging the same amount of rent. And we talk about that, and that every business needs to have an investment in it. And the landlords are trying to see what they can get away with. And knowing there's no housing stock, a lot of people are afraid to fight back because they're worried about getting evicted.
Right.
And we do have protections, but people need people to help protect them. And that's one of the areas where we've been able to really develop our practice because we're there to help.
Right.
And they trust us. I had a really big case that happened a long time ago, well before COVID. It was like in 2009. And I was representing a lot of undocumented people. And I actually had a federal case and some federal court orders in place to make these undocumented persons feel safe to come to the courthouse and testify. And I like to use that as an example to my clients who are undocumented, who are afraid about speaking out. They're worried something bad's going to happen to them. And I think COVID is just one piece of the mix. But I think since COVID, since the moratoriums have been lifted, there's been a lot more activity in the eviction world. And my experience is a lot of people won't fight back unless they're about to lose the roof that's over their head, even if it's a terrible roof that's over their head.
Right.
So,
yeah. And, to your point, as attorneys, we're familiar with the law. We've done a lot of cases. We've represented a lot of clients. We have a familiarity with it, a comfort level with it. But for folks who aren't necessarily as familiar with the legal system, it feels daunting. And, I imagine the landlord-tenant relationship in and of itself is a little inequitable to start, that a lot of folks that are tenants, to your point, just are happy they have a place. They don't want to make waves. They don't want to make trouble. They don't want to put a target on their back to be the next one to be evicted. So I imagine that you deal with a lot of folks that need you to not only explain the law, but, make them feel comfortable with even pursuing the case to begin with.
Many of my clients have never even met a lawyer, much less hired one.
Right.
And they're worried they're going to have to pay us some money, even though we like personal injury lawyers. We do all of our cases on a contingency, so nobody has to pay us anything up front. But there's a lot of lack of understanding of how that process works. And, if I am a father or a mother, because I am a mother, if I'm worried that my kids are going to end up out on the street and we're going to be homeless, I'm going to put up with a lot rather than worrying about being homeless. But I think that people need to understand there are those protections. The law's there for a reason. And we spend a fair amount of time educating our clients, educating judges, educating landlords, and telling them you can't do that because that's against the law. And I think sometimes too, we have these kind of institutional type slumlords that's their business model. And then you just have people who maybe inherited a building from mom and they don't know what they're doing.
Right.
They're doing just as much damage as those institutional ones. But we tend to be a little bit more work through the process.
Right.
With
And I imagine
those
folks are typically more receptive to the points that you're making and more willing to do things that the institutional slumlords
Sometimes, yeah. They certainly, I don't think it's their intended business model. I think sometimes they have, they just don't know any better.
Right.
They just don't know any better, but that they're still accountable. When you're responsible for someone's home, you still have to be accountable for what you do. One other thing I think that's adding to the problems in housing right now, frankly, this is kind of a weird thing to say, but climate change. And because I've noticed, because of those atmospheric rivers that we were having and all those crazy rains and that Game of Thrones kind of winter we had, a lot of that substandard housing has gotten worse because it just can't withstand the attacks from the climate. And people aren't investing to make sure it's secured and secured up. So I would say that if you're a good landlord, then right now, while we don't have rain, it's a good time to start working on that stuff so we don't end up back in that situation again. I've seen a really big increase in mold cases.
Right.
And mold cases get complicated and people read stuff on the internet and they assume certain things. And there's a lot of parts to it that you need someone who's a professional to help you through. But it's never fun to have a river in your house, right?
Well, even right now with the heat waves that we're experiencing, you got to make sure that you got the AC going. And
exactly.
If, not having AC is one thing when it's 75 degrees, and it's another when it's 2 weeks straight of 100+ degrees.
Yes, especially in some of the areas we're in. We do a lot of work throughout the state. And there's some really, really hot areas right now. Yeah. Right now, we're in the valley, right? It's pretty hot here. Can you imagine being without air conditioning right now? I mean, I'm really happy to be in this air-conditioned building right now.
Yeah.
And so, I do see that. I do see that quite a bit. And it's really neat for me because, I am able to take this practice and do my job, which I love doing. And at the same time, I know that I'm doing good.
Sure.
And you and I met in the doing good world, right?
Sure.
We met because that's what we're driven by. It's really cool for me to be able to have a job where I can make a living doing good for people.
Absolutely. So kind of expanding a little bit on our listeners learning about your area of practice, what you do, how you help folks with these housing discrimination and habitability cases. What would you say is typically one of the most common questions you get from clients on a daily basis?
Do I have to pay my rent?
That makes sense.
So that's one question I get. Do I have to pay my rent, and am I going to be evicted if I do go after my landlord?
That makes sense.
And my answer is always yes, pay your rent, because Where you don't want to end up is in eviction court. It's a terrible place to be. It's scary. It's hard to find a lawyer who will help you with eviction cases. We don't do that work. Only in very rare circumstances do we. And it's just not worth the fight to worry about losing your housing, because one of the parts of our case is we ask that the landlord pay the rent back that for the conditions. So if you didn't get a full apartment, you didn't bargain to have cockroaches living in your apartment, then you did get some rent back. So pay the rent and then get it back.
Understood.
So that's the one thing. And when you do pay your rent, make sure you get proper receipts. Don't pay cash. Pay money order or check, or some landlords have electronic transfer options. Make sure you're keeping your documents in order. So that's one big question I get often. Keep your documents in order.
Listen up, folks.
Because the landlords, you can't rely on the landlord keeping those documents in order, because they'll do crazy things with it. And I've seen crazy things happen. And I would say the other question I get is, am I going to be evicted if I stand up for myself? And then the third problem, and we've already talked about that a bit. And I'd say the third is, what can I do to make this better for me? How can I be part of it? What can the tenant do and you got to do your part, clean your apartment, take care of your things. But reporting the problem, it doesn't hurt you. It helps you. It protects you more. And you're more likely to get help if you report the problem. So report the problem to your landlord in writing. Do everything in writing. If it's not in writing, it didn't happen. Right? Writing. Yeah. And then I also report it to your local, whatever your local enforcement agency is. City of LA, it's the Housing and Community Investment Department in Los Angeles. That's a lot of words.
We're putting it on the screen right now.
Or just call 311. But in other jurisdictions, every jurisdiction is going to have a code enforcement department. Call your city, call your county and say, who can I complain to about this bedbug problem, this cockroach problem? Those are the kinds of questions I get. And those are things that people can easily do to help themselves. And then if it doesn't resolve, then call a lawyer. That's what we're here for.
There you have it, folks. All right. Well, this has been very educational even for me because I don't have a lot of exposure to your area of practice. So it's been interesting to hear a lot of what you've been sharing. But now we're going to switch to a segment of the podcast called Underrated, Overrated.
Okay.
And I'm going to throw out some topics. And I need you to tell me whether the topic is underrated, overrated, with a brief 1 to 2 sentence explanation of why. All right, you ready?
Yeah.
SoCal weather.
Underrated, because you never get better.
The Barbie movie.
I loved it. So I don't think you could ever be overrated on that movie. So I'm going to go with underrated too. So that movie was hilarious.
Talking to strangers on an elevator.
Overrated. Don't talk to people on an elevator. That's just weird and creepy. Ew.
FaceTime calls.
Overrated most of the time. Because you really only need to FaceTime with someone if you're like shopping with them over the FaceTime. The rest of the time, just go see them in person.
Ranch dressing.
I would say at this point, I'm going with overrated. When I was young, I loved it. But now that I've gotten older and my food tastes have gotten more sophisticated, I'm more of an aioli girl these days.
Fireworks.
Overrated.
Wow.
Because I'm a dog owner.
Our first guest to call fireworks overrated.
Yes, because my poor dogs, I have to drug them up. I have to get them all doped out and I have to like hold them and then they shake for days and no, overrated.
Postmates.
Postmates, I would say is overrated because I'm more of an Instacart girl.
All right. Twitter rebranding to X.
Overrated. It's all stupid. It really is. It's such a colossal waste of time. I mean, I'm a time waster on those things, but do we really need another social media platform?
We'll find out. Starbucks.
Overrated. Until last year I didn't drink coffee. So I just I have to now. My doctor makes me. But I think Starbucks, as far as in the coffee world, totally overrated. There's much better stuff out there.
Sleeping more than 7 hours in a night.
Underrated. I wish that we could all sleep more than 7 hours every night.
Totally agree.
Yes.
All right. That's been underrated, overrated. Well done. All right. So continuing with the conversation, we're here with guest Chandra Gehri Spencer, partner at Elder and Spencer, specializing in housing discrimination and habitability cases. One interesting thing that's been a topic of late in the legal realm that I'm interested to hear your thoughts about is AI. And I want to know, number one, are you currently using AI in any part of your practice? And number two, whether or not you are, how important do you think AI will be to the practice of law in the coming years?
We're not using it in our practice yet. We're still getting used to some other technology, and moving on to AI is getting people who have been doing things the same way a long time is a challenge. I do use it to plan trips, though. I love it to plan trips. So I feel like we should be using it more, because I think it would, for a small firm in particular, it would be a big time saver and kind of level the playing field on the advantages that we get, the disadvantages we have against the big defense firms. But I'm not comfortable enough with it yet and what it can do. And, you read the horror stories in the news about this person did this whole AI brief and then got sanctioned because it was all garbage. And I think too, like maybe my 8th grade English teacher is yelling at me, telling me to write my own stuff in the back of my head or something.
Right.
So I think it could be, so my brother works in tech, and we actually had this hour-long conversation 2 weeks ago about AI and what could be done to protect the intellectual property element, and is there intellectual property, and there's so many layers to it.
Absolutely.
And I'm sitting back, I've gone to a few of the webinars and sitting back kind of watching what people are saying and doing about it. I think inevitably the expectation is going to be just like any other technology, that we learn how to use it and use it well. But we can't expect it to do our job for us and replace all the things that make us stand out as good lawyers.
Right.
Like the human connection and learning to sense how people are feeling, and the empathy, and the thing that I feel like, especially as a plaintiff's lawyer, that we bring more to the table than anything else is that human connection and human understanding.
Right.
So just like, and I love tech. I was a BlackBerry owner. I had a Palm Pilot when I first started practicing law. That's how old I am. Don't tell anybody that I'm that old.
Nobody will know.
So I had a Palm Pilot. It took me forever to give up my BlackBerry, those things. And so when I go to depositions, I have 2 iPads and a Remarkable and a laptop. Like, I'm a tech girl. But the AI thing, I think the assumption that somehow it's going to take the place of what we need to do to connect, to understand, to relate, and to think for ourselves is the part where I want to make sure that however I'm using it, I'm not letting go of any of that and not relying on the machine to do that for me.
Yeah, I agree. I think, it's an interesting area to look at, especially with AI's intersection with the practice of law, because, number one, obviously, it's this kind of new emerging technology that, everybody's trying to stay at the forefront of and be at the tip of the spear, but no one really, has really wrapped their arms around exactly what it all means and how it's all going to develop. But I think one of the interesting parts about the intersection with the practice of law with AI is that, these AI systems, at least, the ones that are being introduced and built out right now, like ChatGPT, for example, are based on language models.
Right.
And really the practice of law is based on the language model. Mm-hmm. You have statutes, you have, all the laws on the books from the state and federal legislatures, you have all the case law, all the legal precedent, all the cases that have come before that have similar facts or similar arguments or similar court holdings and things like that. And so I do think, as this emerges within the next couple of years, that the legal industry is going to be ripe for integration with AI because of those
Right.
those overlaps. And because of that, sort of synergy between the language model and, kind of the legal foundation being built on this language model. And I imagine that there's going to be a lot of opportunities. But to your point, it used to be, when, different technologies were introduced throughout the Industrial Revolution and whatnot, that it would always take away, the fear was it's going to take away jobs,
Right.
but mostly the manual labor jobs, as machines got built, you didn't need the labor. AI is not taking away the manual labor jobs. AI is taking away some of the creative jobs and some of the
thought jobs.
The thought jobs and the middle class jobs and things like that. So it's going to be interesting to see how it all plays out and how it's used in the coming years. But
Right. I mean, I think one of the things that's kind of unique to us as trial lawyers is AI is not going to stand up in front of a jury and deliver that story and tell that compelling argument and, get tears in your eyes as you're delivering your closing argument, those kinds of things. But it may make some of the more tedious tasks that we have, creating timelines and depositions and some of the beginnings of the brief writing a little faster, a little easier, a little more rote. And so I'm less concerned about me being sick, taking my job, as I'm more concerned about okay, what's this going to do to my staffing requirements and my staffing needs, and making sure that we hire people who support us, who know how to use it and how to use the technology. So I think it's important everyone learn and everyone figure out how to do it. But we also have to figure out how to do it in a way that it doesn't just think for us, because I don't think it ever will be able to fully think for us that way, because it doesn't have the human emotion. I mean, we're professional storytellers, right? As trial lawyers, that's what we do. We tell stories. Well, is AI going to really be able to tell that compelling of a story? It might give us some ideas.
I guess we'll find out.
Yeah, I don't know. I guess we can see. We could maybe in 30 years we'll be having this conversation where we have the AI trial lawyer versus the human trial lawyer, and it'll become like a sport competition or something.
Or maybe in 30 years we'll come back and the robot Brad can interview the robot Chandra. And we'll see if it's as a compelling conversation as we're having today.
Well, if it's robot Chandra, I hope it's less wrinkly then.
Yeah, robot Brad is going to be ripped,
right?
Tanned 24/7. Sky's the limit.
You don't have to shave. Robot Brad won't have to shave. None of that.
All my worries are going to be gone. I'll just be, controlling it with a little
right. Our avatar versus avatar. That would be a really interesting movie plot, wouldn't it? Like an avatar versus avatar, Scope's monkey trial. What would that do? How would that look in those big moments?
That would be interesting.
Yeah.
All right, so enough with the AI. Couple more questions. I'm going to dig down a little bit. If you weren't a lawyer and you could do or be anything in the world, what would it be?
I think that I would run a nonprofit that provides educational opportunities for girls in developing countries.
Cool. And not only cool, but very specific. So it sounds like something that you've given thought to.
Yeah, I kind of think of it as maybe my retirement job.
I love that.
I don't think I'll ever retire because I like to work, but I would see myself moving in a direction of more, what can I do more? The skills I have and the things that matter to me.
Right.
And one of the things that matters to me is making sure that we find ways to pull people out of poverty. And I think the best way to do that is educate, make sure all of the children are getting good education. But in the developing countries, for sure, I think female education has gotten more attention, but needs more resources.
Very cool. All right. And knowing what you know now as a successful trial attorney, doing all the good work that you're doing with your practice, what advice would you give to your 18-year-old self?
One piece of advice I would give is start saving for retirement earlier. And two, I would say, take myself a little less seriously. I think that one of the things that being successful has done has made me like less intense. I think I was really, really intense when I was 8. At least my brother tells me that. So I would say take myself less seriously. I'm not that important. I didn't need to feel like I had to be so intense back then and maybe enjoy life a little more.
Very cool. That's good advice to yourself. All right. We're going to move on now to my personal favorite segment of the podcast called Get the W or Take the L.
Ooh, okay. I haven't heard this one yet.
And I'm going to talk to you about a couple current news stories. I'll give you a little background on the story, and then I'm going to ask you at the end specifically whether, somebody involved in the story is you either give them the W, they get the W, the winner, or they take the L.
They're the loser. Okay.
All right, you ready? All right. A revoked Nevada license plate that was meant to drive away Californians is getting one last chance to go back on the streets. The plate, which read, quote, GOBK, the letter 2, CA, which was short for Go Back to California, was recalled by the Nevada State Department of Motor Vehicles in May after it received a complaint. Now the vehicle owner is appealing the recall and will have a hearing, according to Reno Area News Station. A section of the Nevada Administrative Code applied to the recall prohibits defamatory references to a person or group. So, for appealing the Nevada DMV's revocation of their custom license plate that says go back to California, does this Nevada resident get the W or take the L?
Take the L. There's way more important things to do than worry about whether your license plate format was revoked. Like, move on, buddy. Take the L and move on.
Take the L and go back to Nevada.
Go back to Nevada.
You heard it first. All right. And lastly, appropriate based on your comments from earlier.
Okay.
Billionaire Elon Musk's decision to rebrand Twitter as X could be complicated legally. Companies including Meta and Microsoft already have intellectual property rights to the same letter. X is so widely used and cited in trademarks that it is a candidate for legal challenges, and the company formerly known as Twitter could face its own issues defending its X brand in the future. Quote, there is a 100% chance that Twitter is going to get sued over this by somebody, says trademark attorney Josh Gerben, who said he counted nearly 900 active U.S. trademark registrations that already cover the letter X in a wide range of industries. Elon Musk renamed the social media network Twitter as X this past Monday and unveiled a new logo for the social media platform, a stylized black and white version of the letter. So, for rebranding Twitter to a new company name that others already have IP rights over and guaranteeing the legal challenges that are sure to come, does Elon Musk get the W or take the L?
He takes the L. Like, come on. He's already hemorrhaging money in Twitter and the decisions he's made. He's going to find another reason to hemorrhage more money. And everybody knows the name Twitter. Like, I didn't even know they rebranded it as X until you just told me just now. Like, it would mean nothing to me. And besides, Twitter's cute. That little bird, it's kind of cute. I think you should keep it. Take the L on rebranding.
All right. Well, unfortunately, the Twitter bird is now extinct, but not before
Twitter bird
Elon
died.
Musk. You take the L for your ex, bro. You heard it here first. All right. Well, once again, I want to thank Chandra Gehri Spencer for joining us in studio. It's been a real pleasure to have you.
My pleasure as well, Brad. Thank you.
And hope everyone out there enjoyed this informative podcast episode. We hope to see you on the next one. Stay safe. Take care, everybody. Thank you.
Bye.
Get your win at WallaceWins.com.